The afternoon light was fading over the Scottish Highlands when Balmoral began to fall quiet. Beyond the old stone walls, purple heather moved beneath a cool wind, and the River Dee continued through the valley, as if time had never learned how to stop. The mountains stood in the distance, softened by mist. Nothing in the landscape seemed troubled, nothing hurried. Yet inside one familiar room, surrounded by objects gathered across nearly a century, a woman of 96 years was nearing the end of her life. She had known that room in childhood, in middle age, and in the long winter of old age. She had watched summer sunlight cross its windows and heard rain touch the glass during countless autumn evenings. Now family members were arriving from different directions, some in time, others too late. Her eldest son, Charles, was near. Her daughter, Anne, remained close. Outside, vehicles moved quickly through the estate, but inside the room, time had become strangely still, measured only by breath and silence. History often ends more quietly than people imagine. There are no drums at the final moment, no grand announcement made by the person leaving the world. A hand becomes still, a voice is heard for the last time. A room that has known someone for decades suddenly becomes a room without them. At 3 hours and 10 minutes in the afternoon, the life of Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor came to an end. The longest reign in modern British history had closed without spectacle, in a place she had always regarded as home. Before we travel further into her life, consider subscribing to the channel if you enjoy calm journeys through history and the hidden emotions behind remarkable lives. These stories are remembered not only because they happened, but because someone chooses to listen. Now let the noise of the present fade for a while. Imagine the world becoming slower. Imagine streets lit by gas lamps, letters crossing oceans by ship, and a child entering a family that had no reason to believe she would one day carry a crown. The world she left behind was almost unrecognizable from the one into which she had been born. During her lifetime, 15 British prime ministers had entered and departed government. She had met leaders from every corner of the world. She had lived through war, the collapse of empires, the arrival of television, the first footsteps on the moon, the invention of the internet, and the rise of a world in which people carried powerful computers in their pockets. She had become a bridge between generations that barely understood one another. Yet her story did not begin with certainty. It began with distance from the throne. When Elizabeth was born in London on the 21st of April, 1926, she was not expected to rule. Her grandfather, King George V, sat securely on the throne. Her uncle, Edward, stood first in line and was assumed to marry and produce children. Her father, Albert, came after him. The newborn princess appeared far enough from power that her future seemed predictable, respectable, and relatively private. She arrived not in a vast royal chamber, but in a townhouse belonging to her mother's family. The room was comfortable, though hardly the setting imagined for the birth of a future monarch. Her mother, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, was known for warmth, humor, and an ease with ordinary people. Her father, Prince Albert, Duke of York, was shy and reserved. Public speaking caused him deep distress because of a severe stammer. He preferred quiet family life to ceremony and never expected history to place the crown upon his head. Their household was royal, but it was also affectionate. Compared with older generations of the monarchy, the family lived with a greater sense of closeness. Meals, games, private jokes, and time in the countryside shaped the early years of their daughter. Elizabeth grew up among nannies, lessons, formal rules, and carefully arranged schedules, yet she also knew the security of parents who loved her. Within the boundaries of royal life, her childhood carried something almost ordinary, and perhaps that ordinary happiness later became the private world. She spent her life trying to protect. Those who remembered her as a child often described the same qualities. She was calm, careful, and unusually responsible. She did not seek attention. She liked things to be placed correctly and routines to be followed. She loved horses before she fully understood the world around her. Animals offered a kind of honesty that court life could not. A horse did not bow because of rank. A dog did not care about titles. Around them, she could be less of a princess and more simply a quiet girl learning how to trust. Her younger sister, Margaret, was born 4 years later and brought a very different energy into the family. Margaret was lively, theatrical, and quick to rebel. Elizabeth was measured and observant. One moved toward excitement, the other toward order. Together they created a balance that delighted their parents. The Duke of York sometimes referred to the family as us four, a simple phrase that revealed how they saw themselves, not as an institution, but as a small circle standing together against a complicated world. Summers often carried them north to Balmoral, where the air smelled of rain, grass, and wood smoke. There were walks across the hills, riding lessons, picnics, and long evenings away from London. Christmas brought Sandringham, with its farms, trees, and familiar family customs. Windsor offered another rhythm, older and more formal, with stone walls that seemed to remember every monarch who had passed through them. These places were not merely royal residences. They became emotional landmarks, each one holding a different version of Elizabeth's life. Outside those protected spaces, Britain was changing. The First World War had ended less than a decade before her birth, but its wounds were everywhere. Families still mourned sons who had never returned. Veterans carried injuries that could be seen and others that could not. Industry struggled. Unemployment and labor unrest exposed divisions between wealth and poverty. Across Europe, old monarchies had collapsed, revolutions had redrawn borders, and governments feared that familiar institutions might not survive the new century. The British Empire still appeared enormous. Its territories covered distant regions across Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. Maps in schools showed great areas marked in the color of imperial rule. To many citizens, the empire seemed permanent, almost natural. But permanence is often an illusion maintained by distance. Nationalist movements were growing. Old forms of authority were weakening. The world into which Elizabeth had been born still spoke with the confidence of the 19th century. Yet beneath that confidence, the future was already pressing against the door. For a while, none of this seemed likely to enter the nursery. Elizabeth continued with lessons, horses, family visits, and the calm repetition of childhood. She learned to read, write, draw, and observe the careful manners expected of a princess. She watched adults closely and rarely interrupted. Perhaps she sensed that in royal life, much was communicated through silence. A look across a room, a pause before speaking, or the decision not to speak at all could carry more meaning than an entire conversation. When later generations looked back, they often imagined signs of the queen she would become. They saw destiny in her seriousness and authority in her childhood expression. But childhood memories are easily reshaped by what comes after. The little girl herself could not have known. She was not preparing for the throne because the throne did not belong to her future. She was learning how to behave, how to represent her family, and how to live within rules created long before her birth. History had not yet revealed its intention. Then, in 1936, the structure surrounding her life began to move. Her grandfather died. Her uncle became king. The family expected the line of succession to continue through him, leaving Elizabeth at a safe distance from the burden of sovereignty. But love, scandal, religion, and duty were about to collide. Within a single year, a king would abandon the throne, her reluctant father would inherit it, and a 10-year-old girl would discover that the future she had never imagined was moving directly toward her. There are moments in history that appear to unfold because of carefully planned decisions. Then there are moments that seem almost impossible, shaped instead by coincidence, human weakness, and choices that no one could have predicted. The year 1936 became one of those moments. For the British royal family, it was not simply another chapter in a long dynasty. It was the year an entire future was rewritten. For a quiet 10-year-old princess named Elizabeth, it marked the invisible line between an ordinary royal childhood and a lifetime of extraordinary responsibility. When King George V died in January, the nation entered a period of mourning. Black flags appeared across government buildings. Church bells carried a slower rhythm through towns and villages. Newspapers printed long tributes celebrating a monarch who had guided Britain through the First World War and into a rapidly changing century. For the public, grief mixed with confidence, the future appeared secure, because the next king had already been waiting for years. Edward, Prince of Wales, was admired for his confidence, charm, and modern image. Many believed he represented exactly the kind of monarch the new generation desired. Inside royal residences, however, confidence did not last very long. Whispers that had circulated quietly through drawing rooms suddenly became impossible to ignore. The new king was deeply in love with Wallis Simpson, an American woman whose life stood in direct conflict with the traditions surrounding the British crown. She had already been divorced once and was preparing to end another marriage. In ordinary society, this would already have attracted attention. For the sovereign of the Church of England, it became a constitutional crisis, unlike anything seen for generations. Politicians searched for compromise. Advisors pleaded with the king to reconsider. Newspapers attempted to control rumors before they became public. Members of the royal family watched events unfold with growing anxiety, unsure whether love or duty would ultimately prevail. Edward himself understood the impossible position before him. Remaining king meant abandoning the woman he believed he loved. Marrying her meant abandoning the throne. The entire empire waited, while one man's private decisions slowly transformed into a national question. For young Elizabeth, much of this remained beyond complete understanding. Children often notice changes long before adults explain them. Conversations became quieter whenever she entered a room. Family gatherings carried unfamiliar tension. Faces that once smiled easily now appeared distracted. She could not yet understand constitutional law or political consequences, but she understood that something inside her family had begun to shift. Sometimes children recognize uncertainty not through words but through silence, and the silence inside royal households grew heavier with every passing week. Then came the decision that changed everything. Edward announced that he could not fulfill his responsibilities as king without the woman he loved beside him. Rather than surrender the relationship, he surrendered the crown. With that single choice, one of the oldest institutions in the world suddenly found itself searching for a reluctant successor. History often remembers the speech, the signatures, and the constitutional process. It remembers newspaper headlines and public reaction. But behind all of that stood one deeply personal truth. A brother had stepped away, leaving another brother to carry a burden he had never expected to receive. Prince Albert became King George VI. Few men had ever accepted a crown with less enthusiasm. He knew his own limitations better than anyone. Public speaking remained painfully difficult because of his stammer. He disliked attention. Ceremony exhausted him. Unlike his older brother, he had built a peaceful life believing he would always remain in the background. Now there was no background left. Duty had found him without invitation, and there was no honorable path except forward. His wife, now Queen Elizabeth, understood immediately what had been lost. She watched her husband carry anxiety that rarely appeared in public, but became visible during private moments. The responsibilities of kingship reached into every corner of daily life. Every document demanded attention. Every speech required exhausting preparation. Every journey carried symbolic importance. She also recognized something else. Their eldest daughter would no longer grow up simply as a princess. Unless an unexpected son was born to the king, the crown would eventually pass to Elizabeth. The move from one home to another symbolized more than a change of address. The family left behind the warmth and familiarity of their previous residence and settled into Buckingham Palace, a building admired throughout the world. and yet surprisingly lonely for those who lived inside it. Visitors saw magnificent halls, priceless paintings, glittering chandeliers, and endless ceremonial rooms. Children often noticed something different. Enormous corridors echoed with footsteps. Formal routines replaced comfortable habits. A palace could impress millions while still feeling strangely empty to the people who called it home. From that moment onward, nearly every part of Elizabeth's education changed. Tutors remained important, but their lessons expanded far beyond literature and languages. She now studied constitutional history, the relationship between Parliament and the Crown, the responsibilities expected of a sovereign, and the careful balance that allowed the monarchy to exist within a democratic nation. These were not subjects taught merely to pass examinations. They became preparations for a future that no longer seemed distant. Each lesson quietly reminded her that childhood was ending earlier than anyone had imagined. One of the people who influenced her most deeply during these years was her grandmother, Queen Mary. Dignified, disciplined, and devoted to tradition, Queen Mary believed the monarchy survived not because of privilege but because of self-control. She encouraged serious study and expected careful attention to detail. She wanted her granddaughter to understand that the crown belonged not to the individual wearing it but to an institution older than any single lifetime. Those conversations left a lasting impression upon the young princess, teaching her that personal feelings would always come second to public responsibility. Yet, the greatest teacher remained, her father. Every speech he struggled to deliver became a lesson stronger than any written textbook. Elizabeth watched him prepare for public appearances with determination rather than confidence. She saw the effort hidden behind every successful address. She understood that courage did not always look dramatic. Sometimes courage appeared as a quiet man walking toward another difficult obligation because he believed someone had to do it, without realizing it. She was learning that leadership often meant continuing despite fear rather than acting without it. Outside palace walls, Europe continued moving toward another catastrophe. Dictators rose to power. Armies expanded. Speeches filled with anger echoed across national borders. Newspapers carried alarming reports almost every week. Adults spoke about diplomacy, while secretly preparing for conflict. The peace established after the First World War appeared increasingly fragile. Britain itself hoped that reason would prevail, but hope alone rarely changes the direction of history. While Elizabeth memorized constitutional principles and practiced royal etiquette, the continent around her drifted steadily toward war. Still, there remained moments when she could forget politics altogether. Horses continued to bring quiet happiness. Long walks across country estates offered temporary freedom from ceremony. Evenings spent with her sister reminded her that she was still a young girl despite the expectations gathering around her. Those ordinary experiences mattered because they created memories untouched by crowns or public duty. Throughout her life, whenever official responsibilities became overwhelming, she would search again for those same simple comforts. The countryside, animals, fresh air, and familiar routines became places where she could briefly leave the institution behind and simply exist as herself. Looking back, it is tempting to imagine that destiny announced itself clearly during those years. It did not. Destiny rarely speaks with certainty. Instead, it whispers through small changes that only become meaningful much later. A different tutor, a new lesson, another official engagement, a slightly more serious conversation at dinner. Each seemed insignificant on its own, yet together they slowly transformed a little girl into the future queen of the United Kingdom. She did not yet wear a crown. She had not made the promise that would define her life, but the path leading toward that promise had already begun. And beyond the horizon another force was approaching, one that would test an entire generation as the world descended into the darkness of the Second World War. By the time Europe stood on the edge of another war, Elizabeth was no longer simply a child growing up behind palace walls. Without realizing it, She had become an observer of history before she was old enough to understand all its consequences. Newspapers arrived every morning carrying stories of governments collapsing, armies growing larger, and leaders making promises that sounded reassuring while quietly preparing for conflict. Conversations among ministers became more urgent. Diplomats traveled from one capital to another searching for peace, but beneath every hopeful speech, fear continued to spread across the continent. On the 3rd day of September, 1939, that fear finally became reality. Britain declared war on Germany. Church bells rang, radios interrupted ordinary programming, and millions of families gathered around receivers to hear the announcement that another generation would once again be asked to sacrifice itself. For adults who had survived the First World War, the feeling was painfully familiar. They remembered trenches, telegrams, empty chairs at family tables, and years that had disappeared forever. Now they watched their children preparing to enter another uncertain future. Inside Buckingham Palace, a difficult question appeared almost immediately. Should the two princesses be sent overseas until the danger had passed? Many wealthy families were already arranging for children to travel to Canada or other safer parts of the Commonwealth. London was expected to become a target for bombing, and no one could predict how destructive the coming war might become. Advisors discussed possibilities. Officials examined security plans. Every option carried risks, and every decision would be watched closely by the public. Queen Elizabeth refused to leave. Her answer was calm but absolute. The princesses would not go anywhere without their mother. She herself would never leave the king, and the king, she insisted, would never abandon his people. Those few sentences became far more than a family decision. They became a public symbol that the royal family intended to share the same dangers faced by ordinary citizens. While many children crossed oceans seeking safety, the future Queen of Britain would remain on British soil throughout the conflict. For practical reasons, however, the princesses spent much of the war at Windsor Castle, located west of London and considered less vulnerable than the capital itself. The ancient fortress, with its thick stone walls and centuries of history, became both school and sanctuary. Lessons continued almost every day. Tutors arrived with books and assignments. Routines remained carefully organized because routine itself offered reassurance during uncertain times. Outside the castle, soldiers trained and aircraft crossed the skies. Inside, education continued with remarkable discipline. Even there, war could never be completely forgotten. Air raid sirens interrupted quiet evenings. Blackout curtains covered windows after sunset so enemy aircraft could not identify targets below. Everyone practiced moving quickly toward shelters whenever alarms sounded. Food became limited under rationing, and even the royal household adjusted to shortages that affected the entire nation. Vegetables were grown in castle gardens, clothing was repaired rather than replaced, and unnecessary luxury quietly disappeared. The princess, who had grown up surrounded by privilege, was beginning to understand a country learning to live with sacrifice. Those years shaped Elizabeth in ways no classroom ever could. Responsibility no longer existed, only inside history books or constitutional lessons. She watched her parents travel repeatedly into bomb-damaged neighborhoods after air raids, speaking with families who had lost homes and loved ones. They visited hospitals filled with wounded soldiers, factories producing equipment for the war effort, and neighborhoods where ordinary people continued rebuilding despite constant danger. Every journey carried enormous personal risk, yet neither the king nor the queen considered avoiding such duties. Her father remained an especially powerful example. Every speech still required enormous effort because of his stammer, yet he continued addressing the nation whenever encouragement was needed most. People listening through radios understood that his voice sometimes struggled, but that struggle itself became inspiring. He was not pretending to be fearless. Instead, he demonstrated that courage often meant speaking despite fear. Years later, Elizabeth would remember not polished words but determined perseverance. Leadership, she learned, was measured less by confidence than by consistency. At the age of 14, she received an opportunity to serve in her own small way. During a special radio broadcast directed toward children who had been separated from families through wartime evacuation, Elizabeth spoke with quiet confidence. Many young listeners had left parents behind in dangerous cities and now lived with strangers in unfamiliar villages. Loneliness had become part of childhood. The young princess offered simple reassurance rather than dramatic promises. She reminded them that difficult seasons eventually passed, and that hope could survive even during the darkest nights. Countless listeners later remembered hearing not a distant royal figure but another young person sharing the same uncertain future. The experience revealed something important. Unlike her father, Elizabeth possessed a calm, steady speaking voice that carried naturally across the radio. She did not rely upon theatrical emotion or grand language. Instead, people trusted the quiet certainty with which she spoke. This would become one of the defining characteristics of her public life. She rarely attempted to inspire through excitement. She inspired through steadiness. In moments when others panicked, she remained composed. And that composure itself became reassuring. As she grew older, remaining safely behind castle walls became increasingly uncomfortable for her. She understood that thousands of young women close to her own age were joining military organizations, learning practical skills, and contributing directly to the war effort. She wanted to do more than observe events from a distance. After repeated requests, permission was finally granted. In the final year of the war, she entered the Auxiliary Territorial Service, becoming the first female member of the royal family to serve as an active participant in the armed forces. Training surprised many people who imagined royal service would be largely ceremonial. Instead, Elizabeth learned to drive military vehicles, repair engines, replace damaged tires, and perform mechanical tasks alongside other recruits. Grease stained her hands. Heavy tools replaced white gloves. Uniforms replaced elegant dresses. For perhaps the first time in her life, strangers judged her less by title than by competence. Instructors expected discipline, accuracy, and effort from everyone. Including the future queen, she welcomed those expectations because they allowed her to contribute rather than simply symbolize. There was something quietly liberating about those months. The daughter of a king discovered satisfaction in practical work completed with her own hands. Machines did not care about royal blood. An engine either functioned or it did not. A damaged vehicle either returned to service or remained unusable. These straightforward realities offered relief from the endless layers of ceremony surrounding palace life. Throughout her later years, people who worked closely with her often noticed genuine respect for skilled craftsmen, mechanics, farmers, and stable workers. Perhaps part of that respect had been earned during those wartime experiences. When victory in Europe was finally declared, joy swept across the nation with astonishing force. Streets filled with singing crowds. Strangers embraced one another. Church bells rang without interruption. After years of darkness, people celebrated simply because they were alive. On that unforgettable evening, Elizabeth and her sister Margaret received rare permission to leave the palace quietly and join the crowds without drawing attention. Surrounded by thousands of celebrating citizens, they walked through London almost anonymously, laughing, singing, and sharing in a happiness that belonged to everyone. Many decades later, Elizabeth would still describe that night as one of the happiest memories of her entire life, not because she had stood above the crowd, but because for a few precious hours, she had disappeared inside it. She experienced victory not as a princess waving from a balcony, but as another young woman grateful that war had finally ended. Perhaps that brief taste of ordinary freedom made its eventual loss even more meaningful. Because while peace had returned to Europe, another chapter of her own life was quietly beginning. Through letters exchanged during the war with a young naval officer named Philip, a relationship had been growing, one that would soon shape both her private happiness and the future of the monarchy. The war had ended, but peace did not arrive all at once. Across Britain, buildings still stood damaged. Families continued mourning those who never returned, and ration books remained part of everyday life. Victory had been achieved at an enormous cost. Cities were rebuilding one brick at a time. Factories shifted from producing military equipment back to civilian goods. Millions of people tried to rediscover routines that had disappeared years before. Amid that slow recovery, a young princess found herself standing between two very different futures. One offered the possibility of a quiet family life. The other pointed toward responsibilities she could neither postpone nor escape. During the years of war, letters had crossed oceans and naval bases carrying thoughts between Elizabeth and a young officer named Philip. Their first meetings had taken place years earlier when she was still a child, but distance and time had transformed a simple acquaintance into something much deeper. While serving with the Royal Navy, Philip wrote with humor, honesty, and a refreshing lack of ceremony. Unlike many people who surrounded the princess, he rarely seemed intimidated by royal tradition. He spoke to her naturally, and perhaps that ordinary honesty became one of the qualities she valued most. Philip himself had experienced a childhood far removed from stability. Although born a prince of Greece and Denmark, his early life was marked by exile, uncertainty, and separation. His family lost their position when political upheaval forced them to leave their homeland. He grew up moving from one country to another, attending different schools and living under the care of various relatives. Unlike Elizabeth, whose childhood had been defined by consistency and structure, Philip had learned to adapt constantly. Hardship had made him independent, practical, and resilient. The contrast between them was striking. She valued routine, careful planning, and quiet reflection. He enjoyed challenge, action, and direct conversation, where she often measured every word before speaking. Philip preferred straightforward honesty, sometimes so direct that it surprised people around him, yet differences can sometimes become strengths within a relationship. Each possessed qualities the other lacked. Together they formed a balance that neither could have created alone. After the war, opportunities to meet became more frequent. They walked together during family gatherings, exchanged conversations away from crowded receptions, and gradually began imagining a shared future. To outside observers, however, the relationship appeared far from ideal. Members of the British establishment questioned almost every aspect of Philip's background. Although he carried royal blood, he had no kingdom to inherit. His family history was complicated, his financial situation modest, and several relatives had associations that made some officials deeply uncomfortable. In the years immediately following the war, none of those objections mattered very much to Elizabeth. She had reached an age where affection could no longer be dismissed as youthful admiration. Those closest to her noticed a quiet certainty that rarely appeared in matters of personal emotion. She seldom argued loudly or defended herself dramatically. Instead, once her mind was made up, changing it became extraordinarily difficult. Beneath her gentle manner existed remarkable determination. It would become one of the defining qualities of her reign, though during these early years it revealed itself simply through unwavering loyalty to the man she loved. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth observed the relationship with understandable caution. They respected Philip's military service and admired many of his personal qualities, yet they also recognized the immense pressure their daughter would eventually face. Marriage for the future, sovereign could never remain entirely private. Every personal decision carried constitutional, political, and symbolic consequences. They therefore encouraged patience rather than immediate engagement, not because they wished to prevent the marriage, but because they wanted certainty that both young people fully understood the life awaiting them. While these private questions unfolded, public responsibilities continued expanding. The king's health had begun to weaken noticeably. Years of smoking, combined with the relentless pressure of unexpected kingship, slowly eroded his strength. Official engagements that once seemed routine became increasingly exhausting. Doctors advised rest whenever possible, Yet rest remained difficult for a monarch expected to represent stability during a period of enormous national reconstruction. Without drawing attention to the situation, more duties gradually passed to his eldest daughter. In 1947, Elizabeth embarked upon her first major overseas journey, traveling with her parents through southern Africa. The visit lasted several months and introduced the young princess to distant parts of the Commonwealth that she had previously known only through maps and official reports. Crowds gathered wherever the royal family appeared. Children waved small flags along dusty roads. Musicians welcomed them in cities filled with unfamiliar languages and traditions. The trip expanded her understanding of the vast community connected, however imperfectly, through the British Crown. During that journey came one of the defining moments of her entire life. On her 21st birthday, speaking by radio from Cape Town, she addressed people throughout the Commonwealth. Her words sounded simple enough, yet they would echo through every decade that followed. She declared that her whole life, whether long or short, would be devoted to the service of her people, and many speeches disappear almost as soon as they are delivered. To this one endured because it became more than carefully prepared language. It became the standard by which history would later judge her. Perhaps the remarkable quality of that promise lay in its timing. She spoke those words before becoming queen. She still believed her father might reign for many years. She hoped to enjoy married life, raise children, and slowly prepare for responsibilities lying somewhere in the distant future. There was no urgency forcing such a declaration. Precisely because it was offered freely, without immediate necessity, it carried unusual sincerity. Decades later, people would return to those sentences, not because they were beautifully written, but because she spent the remainder of her life attempting to honor them. Shortly after returning home, the engagement between Elizabeth and Philip was officially announced. Before the announcement, Philip had taken several significant steps to ease public concern. He renounced his foreign royal titles, became a British citizen, adopted the surname Mountbatten from his mother's family, and embraced the traditions expected within British public life. These changes did not erase every criticism, but they demonstrated his willingness to build a future beside the woman he loved, rather than remain attached to privileges from the past. Their wedding took place in November 1947 at Westminster Abbey. Although Britain remained under rationing, the ceremony offered the nation a rare moment of celebration after years of hardship. Streets filled with cheering spectators. Radios carried the event into homes throughout the country. People who had endured bombing, shortages, and personal loss welcomed an occasion that allowed hope to briefly replace exhaustion. Even Elizabeth's wedding dress reflected the realities of the time, requiring clothing ration coupons just like those used by ordinary citizens. The future queen entered married life surrounded not by extravagance alone but by a country still learning how to recover. For a short period afterward, life became unexpectedly normal. Philip resumed naval service, and the young couple spent time in Malta, where his duties required him to remain away from constant attention in London. They experienced something remarkably close to ordinary married life. They visited friends, drove themselves, entertained guests without elaborate ceremony, and enjoyed evenings that belonged only to them. Those who knew Elizabeth during those months often remarked that she appeared especially relaxed. For perhaps the last time in her life, their happiness grew with the arrival of their first child, Charles, followed later by their daughter Anne. The small family appeared to have years stretching comfortably before them. Philip's naval career flourished. The children were healthy. The king, though often tired, continued carrying out his duties. From the outside, it seemed entirely possible that Elizabeth might spend another decade or even longer as a devoted wife and mother before ever wearing a crown. But history rarely asks permission before changing direction. While the young family looked toward the future with quiet optimism, King George VI was becoming weaker with every passing month, and events already moving beyond their control were drawing steadily closer. During the final months of 1951, Those closest to King George VI could no longer ignore the truth. Although official statements continued to describe his condition with careful optimism, the king was becoming noticeably weaker. Years of relentless duty, combined with the physical consequences of heavy smoking and the strain of carrying responsibilities he had never expected to bear, had slowly taken their toll. Those who worked with him watched an energetic man become increasingly tired after even the shortest public appearances. Every staircase seemed a little steeper. Every speech demanded greater effort than the one before. Elizabeth noticed these changes more clearly than most people. Daughters often recognized small differences that escaped the public eye. She saw the fatigue hidden behind polite smiles. She noticed the pauses that lasted slightly longer than before. Conversations that had once continued easily now ended because her father simply lacked the strength to continue. Although neither of them spoke openly about what lay ahead, both understood that time was beginning to move more quickly than either wished. The lessons he had quietly taught throughout her childhood were no longer theoretical. They were becoming preparations for a future that neither father nor daughter wanted to arrive so soon. As the king reduced his workload, Elizabeth accepted more official responsibilities on his behalf. She represented the crown during ceremonies, welcomed visiting dignitaries, and undertook overseas tours that her father could no longer complete. Each assignment increased her experience, yet every successful engagement carried an unspoken sadness. She was learning to perform the role because the man who should have been performing it was slowly losing the ability to continue. It was an education, shaped not by ambition but by necessity. Despite his worsening health, King George VI remained determined to appear hopeful. During family gatherings, he focused his attention on his grandchildren, smiling more easily when surrounded by children than during formal audiences with ministers. Christmas at Sandringham offered brief moments of comfort. Laughter returned to the house. The family shared meals, exchanged gifts, and attempted, however briefly, to forget hospitals, medical examinations, and worrying reports. Those precious days now seem almost suspended outside time, the final peaceful chapter before everything changed forever. Early in 1952, plans moved forward for a major Commonwealth tour. Because the king was too ill to travel, Elizabeth and Philip would undertake the journey in his place. The itinerary included several countries across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. Preparations lasted for weeks. Officials organized ceremonies, speeches, transportation, and security arrangements. Newspapers described the visit as another important step in strengthening relationships throughout the Commonwealth. Few people imagined that the tour would become remembered for an entirely different reason. On the morning of departure, King George VI insisted on accompanying his daughter to the airport despite his fragile condition. Photographs from that day reveal a father smiling warmly while saying goodbye. Though the signs of illness were already visible to careful observers, Elizabeth embraced him before boarding the aircraft. Neither realized they were sharing their final conversation. History often preserves dramatic farewells, yet most final meetings appear completely ordinary while they are happening. People promise to meet again, expecting another tomorrow that quietly never arrives. The journey began successfully. Official receptions welcomed the young royal couple with enthusiasm wherever they traveled. After arriving in Kenya, they stayed for a short time at Treetops, a remarkable lodge built high among the branches of giant trees overlooking a watering place where wild animals gathered throughout the night. Elephants wandered below. Antelope moved carefully through the darkness. Distant sounds drifted across the African landscape beneath endless stars. It was a place unlike anywhere Elizabeth had ever visited. Peaceful enough that it seemed impossible tragedy could exist anywhere nearby. While she slept, thousands of kilometers away in England, her father died quietly at Sandringham House during the early hours of the morning. There were no final conversations. No dramatic last words shared with family members gathered around his bed. Death came peacefully, ending years of struggle almost without warning. He was only 56 years old. The shy prince who had never wished to become king had fulfilled his duty until the very end, giving far more of himself than anyone had believed possible when the crown first descended upon him after his brother's abdication. Because communications moved far more slowly than they do today, several hours passed before the news reached Kenya. Officials worked carefully to confirm the information before informing the princess. Philip received the message first. Realizing that every second after that moment belonged to history, he searched for his wife. Away from reporters and formal surroundings, he gently explained that her father had died. Witnesses later recalled remarkable composure. There were no public displays of emotion. Grief certainly existed, but it remained private. Almost immediately, personal sorrow became inseparable from constitutional reality. At that exact moment, without ceremony or proclamation, Elizabeth ceased to be simply a daughter mourning her father. By law and tradition, she had instantly become queen. The transformation required no coronation, no oath, and no official announcement. One reign ended with a final breath, and another began in the same instant. She had awakened that morning as a princess. Before sunset, she carried the weight of the British crown. She was only 25 years old. The remainder of the tour was cancelled immediately. Preparations shifted from celebration to mourning. Black clothing had to be located before the journey home because proper mourning attire had not accompanied the luggage. When the aircraft carrying the new queen landed in London, the atmosphere differed completely from the cheerful departure only days earlier. Ministers, senior officials, and Winston Churchill, once again serving as Prime Minister, waited silently to receive their new sovereign. Photographers captured the image of a young woman dressed in black descending the aircraft steps. It became one of the defining photographs of the 20th century, not because it displayed triumph, but because it revealed the quiet loneliness that often accompanies great responsibility. For Elizabeth, the emotional burden proved immense. She had lost not only a father she deeply loved, but also the greatest teacher she had ever known. Throughout childhood and adolescence, King George VI had demonstrated that duty mattered more than comfort, perseverance mattered more than confidence, and service mattered more than personal ambition. Now those lessons belonged entirely to her. There would be no further guidance during weekly conversations, no reassuring advice before difficult decisions, no father standing quietly behind her while she learned. The responsibility had become hers alone. Public mourning spread rapidly across Britain and throughout the Commonwealth. Church bells rang once more. Newspapers published special editions. Crowds gathered outside royal residences in respectful silence. People remembered the king not as a brilliant speaker or charismatic ruler, but as an honest man who had accepted an impossible burden and carried it with dignity. Many citizens felt genuine affection because they recognized something of themselves in his struggles. He had never appeared perfect. Precisely for that reason, he had become deeply admired. Amid those days of mourning, practical responsibilities allowed little time for private grief. Meetings with ministers began almost immediately. Official documents required signatures. Decisions concerning ceremonies, constitutional procedures, and future engagements demanded attention. Every conversation reminded the young queen that history rarely pauses to accommodate personal sorrow. Even while mourning her father, she found herself comforting others, receiving condolences, and preparing to assume the visible role expected by millions of people who look toward the crown for continuity. She chose to reign under the name Elizabeth II, continuing the name by which the world had always known her. The decision carried symbolic significance and immediately connected her with centuries of royal tradition while also opening an entirely new chapter in British history. Yet behind the constitutional language and public ceremony remained a simple human truth. A daughter had boarded an airplane expecting eventually to return home to her father. Instead, she returned carrying his crown. Within little more than a week, her entire life had been transformed forever. Ahead lay the coronation, the ancient ceremony that would formally place upon her head not merely a jeweled crown, but the visible weight of every promise she had ever made. The days following the death of King George VI unfolded with remarkable precision, as though centuries of tradition had already prepared every step long before any person living could remember. Official documents moved between government offices. Church leaders, military commanders, judges, and ministers quietly began the countless preparations required whenever one reign ended and another began. To the outside world, the transition appeared almost effortless. Inside the palace, however, the young queen was experiencing something far more personal. She was learning that grief rarely waits until work has been completed. Instead, grief often walks beside responsibility, asking to be carried together. Every morning brought another stack of papers, requiring careful attention. Constitutional reports, diplomatic correspondence, military briefings, and government recommendations arrived in the now familiar red boxes that would eventually accompany her throughout the rest of her life. There was no handbook capable of preparing someone for this moment. She had studied history for years, yet history felt entirely different once she herself became responsible for writing its next chapter. Decisions that once belonged to others now waited patiently upon her desk, each demanding thoughtful consideration before the day could continue. Winston Churchill, serving once again as Prime Minister, understood better than most the extraordinary situation facing the young sovereign. He had first met Elizabeth when she was only a little girl. Now he stood before her, not as an elderly statesman greeting a child, but as the head of government advising his queen. Their age difference stretched across nearly half a century. His experience reached back to the final years of Queen Victoria, while her reign had only just begun. Despite those differences, a relationship built upon mutual respect quickly developed. Churchill admired her discipline, while she appreciated his wisdom and deep understanding of constitutional tradition. Throughout those early weeks, Elizabeth remained careful not to reveal too much emotion in public. Some later observers interpreted this reserve as coldness, but those who knew her personally described something very different. She believed that people looked to the monarchy for steadiness rather than personal display. If the sovereign appeared overwhelmed, uncertainty might spread far beyond palace walls. Therefore, she chose composure, not because sorrow was absent, but because she believed self-control formed part of her responsibility. It was a lesson inherited directly from both her father and grandmother, who had taught that private feelings should never weaken public confidence. Plans for the coronation soon became one of the largest organizational efforts undertaken in post-war Britain. Unlike the automatic legal transfer of the crown that had already taken place, the coronation would provide a visible moment through which the nation and the Commonwealth could recognize the beginning of a new era. Tradition suggested allowing a significant period of mourning before the ceremony. This interval also provided time to organize an event involving thousands of participants, foreign representatives, military units, musicians, clergy, and craftsmen. Every detail required careful planning because the ceremony carried not only religious meaning but also constitutional and historical significance. For Elizabeth, preparation extended beyond official meetings. She spent many hours learning details that few outside the royal household ever considered. The imperial state crown, although magnificent, was surprisingly heavy. Moving naturally while wearing it demanded practice. Ceremonial robes required careful handling because of their considerable weight and length. Every movement inside Westminster Abbey followed traditions refined over hundreds of years. There were precise moments for walking, standing, kneeling, turning, and speaking. Nothing was left entirely to chance because each gesture represented continuity with monarchs reaching back across nearly 1,000 years of British history. Sometimes rehearsals took place inside empty halls where silence echoed against ancient stone. Attendants adjusted robes. Officials measured distances. Musicians practiced passages that had accompanied generations of sovereigns before her. Standing within those spaces, Elizabeth could almost feel history surrounding her from every direction. Countless kings and queens had faced similar moments, each believing their own challenges unique. yet each eventually becoming another chapter within a much longer story. Perhaps that realization brought unexpected comfort. Individuals passed away, institutions endured. Her task was not to reinvent the monarchy, but to guide it faithfully through another generation. Outside the palace, Britain itself continued recovering from war. Bomb sites still interrupted familiar streets across London. Rationing remained part of daily life. Families worked tirelessly to rebuild businesses, homes, and communities damaged during years of conflict. And many questioned whether a grand coronation should proceed while ordinary citizens continued facing economic hardship. Others argued that the ceremony offered something equally important. After years defined by sacrifice and uncertainty, the nation deserved a moment capable of inspiring hope. Eventually, that belief prevailed. The coronation would not celebrate wealth or privilege alone. It would symbolize renewal after one of the most difficult periods in modern British history. Technological change also influenced planning in ways earlier monarchs had never imagined. Television ownership was expanding rapidly across Britain, and many people hoped the ceremony might be broadcast directly into family homes. Some senior advisors opposed the idea, fearing that ancient religious traditions would lose dignity if transformed into ordinary entertainment. Others believed allowing millions of people to witness the event could strengthen the monarchy by bringing citizens closer to an institution often viewed from a distance. The debate continued for months before a decision was finally reached in favor of television coverage. That choice quietly altered history. For the first time, enormous numbers of ordinary families would experience the coronation, not through newspaper descriptions or painted illustrations, but with their own eyes. Neighbors gathered inside living rooms around newly purchased television sets. Shops placed receivers inside display windows so crowds could watch together from the street. Children who had never before seen the inside of Westminster Abbey suddenly found themselves observing ceremonies once witnessed only by nobles, clergy, and invited guests. Without intending to, the young queen helped carry one of the world's oldest institutions into the modern age. While preparations continued, Elizabeth struggled privately with another challenge. She deeply loved Philip, yet becoming queen inevitably changed the balance within their marriage. Before the king's death, they had imagined many years during which Philip could continue developing his naval career while they gradually prepared for future responsibilities. Those hopes disappeared almost overnight. His military ambitions would necessarily become secondary to supporting his wife's role as sovereign. Such sacrifices rarely attracted headlines, but they formed an important part of the life they would build together. Both understood that the crown demanded adjustments from everyone closest to it. Rather than allowing disappointment to create distance, Philip chose commitment. He devoted increasing attention to understanding the complex machinery of monarchy, recognizing that his own future would now unfold beside the woman who had unexpectedly become queen at only 25 years of age. He often encouraged her to relax whenever official schedules permitted, reminding her that behind every ceremony remained an ordinary human being who still needed laughter, conversation, and moments of quiet. Those private moments became increasingly valuable because public life offered fewer opportunities for simple normality. Throughout the spring leading toward the coronation, Elizabeth frequently reflected upon the promise she had made several years earlier in South Africa, declaring that her whole life would be devoted to service. At the time, those words had seemed almost symbolic, a hopeful expression offered by a young princess looking toward a distant future. Now they carried entirely different meaning. Service was no longer an abstract ideal. It shaped every hour of every day, every document she signed, every audience she received. Every journey she undertook represented another opportunity to honor that youthful commitment. As the date of the coronation approached, anticipation spread far beyond Britain. Representatives from across the Commonwealth prepared to travel to London. Journalists arrived from every continent. Streets were decorated with flags, banners, and flowers. Despite continuing economic difficulties, hotels filled with visitors, eager to witness history. Beneath the excitement, however, the queen herself remained remarkably calm. She understood that the ceremony would be magnificent, but she also understood something even more important. When the music ended, the crowds dispersed, and the jeweled crown was returned to its secure place. The true work of her reign would still be waiting the following morning. The celebration would last only a single day. The responsibility would remain for the rest of her life. On the morning of the coronation, London awakened long before sunrise. The streets were already alive with movement as police officers, soldiers, journalists, and thousands of ordinary people quietly gathered along the procession route. Many had arrived during the night carrying folding chairs, blankets, and baskets of food, determined to secure a place from which they could witness a moment that their grandparents had once described, but very few had personally experienced. Despite the cool morning air, excitement traveled through the crowd like a slow rising tide. People smiled at strangers, shared tea, and spoke softly about history, knowing that before the day ended they would have seen the beginning of a new reign. Inside Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere could not have been more different. While crowds celebrated outside, the young queen moved through the early hours with remarkable calm. Attendants helped prepare ceremonial garments that had required months of careful workmanship. Every piece carried centuries of meaning. Embroidered silk, velvet robes, jeweled ornaments, white gloves, and carefully preserved regalia represented not fashion but continuity. Countless hands adjusted fabrics, examined details, and ensured that every tradition would be respected exactly as generations before had intended. Elizabeth had practiced for this day many times, yet rehearsal could never remove the emotional weight of the real moment. She understood that millions of eyes would follow every movement she made. One uncertain step might become tomorrow's newspaper headline. One forgotten gesture could overshadow years of preparation. Yet, beneath those practical concerns rested something far deeper. She was about to accept publicly the responsibility that had already become hers the moment her father died. The ceremony would not make her queen. It would ask her to declare before God and the nation that she accepted everything the crown required. The state coach, carrying the queen, slowly departed the palace, its wheels moving across streets lined with cheering crowds stretching farther than anyone could easily see. Children sat upon their fathers' shoulders waving small flags. Elderly couples remembered another coronation decades earlier and quietly compared one generation with another. Visitors from distant countries listened as church bells echoed across London, blending with military bands whose music rolled through the city like waves. Despite the enormous crowds, many later recalled an unexpected feeling of respect, almost as though everyone understood instinctively that they were witnessing more than a public celebration. When the procession reached Westminster Abbey, the ancient building seemed to gather together the voices of nearly 1,000 years of history. Kings had entered through those doors. Queens had walked across the same stone floor. Generations had prayed beneath the same towering arches, while wars, revolutions, discoveries, and empires rose and disappeared beyond its walls. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, painting quiet colors across the old stone. The abbey had witnessed countless human lives, each believing its own time to be permanent. Yet the building itself remained, patiently watching history continue. As Elizabeth entered the abbey, music filled the vast interior with extraordinary richness. Choirs, orchestras, clergy, judges, military leaders, foreign representatives, members of parliament, and invited guests stood together beneath soaring ceilings that seemed almost too large for ordinary human voices. Every person present understood that they were participating in a ceremony whose roots reached back centuries before their own birth. Tradition surrounded them from every direction, reminding everyone that no individual, regardless of status, ever stood entirely alone inside history. The service unfolded slowly, each stage following customs preserved across generations. Questions were asked, promises were made, prayers filled the silence between ancient rituals. Perhaps the most private moment came during the sacred anointing, when screens shielded the queen from public view. Unlike the jewels, robes, and music that could be admired by spectators, this act emphasized humility rather than grandeur. It reminded everyone present that beneath every symbol of monarchy stood an ordinary human being accepting a solemn responsibility before God rather than performing for an audience. When the imperial state crown was finally placed upon her head, the weight was far greater than appearances suggested. Crafted from gold and decorated with remarkable gemstones collected throughout centuries, it demanded complete balance and careful posture. Elizabeth had spent weeks learning how to move naturally while wearing it. Even the slightest turn required concentration. Later, she would occasionally speak with gentle humor about the practical challenges of wearing such a heavy object, reminding listeners that even the most magnificent symbols often came with surprisingly ordinary inconveniences. Outside the abbey, cannon fire echoed across London as church bells answered from every direction. Similar celebrations unfolded throughout the United Kingdom and across the Commonwealth. Ships sounded their horns in distant harbors. Communities organized local gatherings. Families crowded into living rooms where newly purchased television sets flickered with images transmitted from Westminster Abbey. For countless people, this became not only their first opportunity to witness a coronation, but also one of the earliest major events they had ever watched live through television. Technology quietly transformed a ceremony once reserved for a privileged few into a shared experience connecting millions of households. That decision to permit television cameras proved far more significant than many advisors had expected. Critics had feared that broadcasting sacred traditions would reduce their dignity. Instead, something different occurred. People who had always regarded the monarchy as distant suddenly found themselves invited inside one of its most important ceremonies. Children watched beside grandparents. Neighbors gathered wherever a television could be found. Conversations continued long after the service ended because ordinary families felt they had participated rather than merely observed from afar. Without changing the ceremony itself, the monarchy had taken an important step toward a more modern relationship with the public. After returning to Buckingham Palace, the Queen appeared on the famous balcony overlooking enormous crowds filling the mall. Voices rose together in celebration while flags covered the avenue below. Aircraft crossed overhead in carefully organized formations. Photographers captured images that would soon appear in newspapers around the world. To many observers, the day represented fairy tale grandeur, dazzling uniforms, glittering jewels, magnificent horses, and centuries of pageantry. Yet behind those unforgettable images stood a young woman who had lost her father only months earlier and who now carried responsibilities extending far beyond anything visible from the palace balcony. When evening finally arrived and official celebrations gradually drew to a close, quiet returned once more to the royal residence. The cheering crowds slowly dispersed. Musicians packed away instruments. Lights across London began disappearing one by one. Somewhere inside the palace, the crown that had rested upon the Queen's head was carefully returned to secure protection until another great state occasion required its use. Ceremonial robes were removed. Official photographs had already begun their journey around the world. The most spectacular day of her life had ended. Yet, as Elizabeth prepared for another morning, she understood a truth that many outside the palace could not fully appreciate. The coronation had never been the destination. It had only been the beginning. Tomorrow, the familiar red boxes would once again arrive, filled with government papers. Ministers would request audiences. Ambassadors would present credentials. Letters would require signatures. Journeys would need planning. Decisions, however limited by constitutional convention, would demand attention every single day. The applause of the coronation would gradually fade into memory, but the discipline of service would continue without interruption. From that day forward, her life would be measured not by extraordinary ceremonies, but by thousands of ordinary days devoted quietly, consistently, and almost without pause to the promise she had made years earlier. a promise that would now shape every remaining chapter of her remarkable life. Once the celebration had passed, the rhythm of royal life revealed itself with surprising simplicity. To many people around the world, becoming queen appeared to be the end of a long journey, the highest point any monarch could reach. In reality, it was only the first ordinary morning of a lifetime, defined not by ceremonies, but by repetition. After the jeweled crown had been returned to its secure place, and the music inside Westminster Abbey had faded into memory, another day arrived exactly as every day would afterward. Papers waited upon her desk. Appointments filled the calendar. Decisions, conversations, audiences, and journeys stretched endlessly into the future. Every morning followed a routine that changed very little over the decades. Before much of the country had begun its day, official documents had already reached the palace inside the familiar red boxes. They contained reports from government departments, diplomatic correspondence, military updates, requests requiring royal approval, and countless briefings prepared by civil servants. Each page demanded careful reading. Although the constitutional monarchy no longer exercised direct political power, the sovereign remained informed about every major development affecting the nation. Understanding came before speaking. Listening came before offering opinion. Discipline began with preparation. Those who worked beside the Queen often remarked that she approached paperwork with remarkable consistency. There were no dramatic gestures, no hurried decisions, and very little impatience. Instead, she read methodically, asking questions whenever clarification became necessary. She rarely believed that long experience removed the need for careful attention. Perhaps that habit explained one of the quiet strengths of her reign. Familiarity never became an excuse for carelessness. After reading similar documents for years, she continued treating each one with the seriousness expected from someone entrusted with public responsibility. One of the most important duties in her weekly schedule involved meeting privately with the Prime Minister. No secretaries remained inside the room. No recordings were made. No official transcript preserved the conversation. These meetings allowed the head of government to discuss national affairs with complete confidentiality, while the sovereign listened, questioned, and occasionally offered observations shaped by decades of experience. Over 70 years, 15 prime ministers entered those private audiences. Each arrived carrying different political beliefs, different personalities, and different priorities. The Queen remained the single constant presence through every change of government. It was an unusual relationship. Prime ministers possessed political authority but depended upon elections. The Queen possessed no electoral mandate yet represented continuity beyond politics itself. Governments rose and fell. Parties won victories and suffered defeats. Policies changed with every generation. Through all those transformations, she remained seated in the same room, asking thoughtful questions, encouraging careful reflection, and maintaining strict neutrality. Perhaps that neutrality became one of the monarchy's greatest strengths. She understood that public confidence depended upon remaining above political disagreement rather than participating within it. Outside official meetings, another endless procession filled her calendar. Ambassadors from distant countries presented letters of introduction. Military officers received promotions and decorations. Scientists, artists, athletes, musicians, volunteers, and community leaders visited the palace to receive honors recognizing years of service. Each ceremony required preparation because every individual deserved personal attention rather than mechanical politeness. Before every audience, briefing notes introduced names, achievements, families, and significant details. The Queen believed remembering even small pieces of information demonstrated respect for the people standing before her. Thousands of handshakes became part of everyday life. Countless conversations lasted only a few moments, yet those moments often remained unforgettable for the individuals involved. People frequently arrived feeling nervous, uncertain about protocol, worried they might say something inappropriate. Within minutes, Many discovered a woman capable of putting strangers at ease through quiet humor or an unexpected question. She rarely attempted to dominate conversations. Instead, she encouraged others to speak about their own experiences. That ability transformed formal encounters into surprisingly human exchanges. State banquets offered another visible part of royal duty. Though the elegance seen in photographs often concealed extraordinary preparation, guest lists reflected delicate diplomatic considerations. Seating arrangements balanced politics, culture, and protocol. Menus were discussed in detail. Speeches required careful wording because a single misplaced sentence could unintentionally create international misunderstanding. While guests admired crystal chandeliers, polished silver, and beautifully arranged flowers, countless staff members worked behind the scenes ensuring every detail unfolded smoothly. The Queen appreciated those invisible efforts, often thanking employees whose names rarely appeared in newspapers. Despite their essential contribution, foreign tours became one of the defining features of her reign. Year after year she traveled across continents representing the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth. Airports, train stations, harbors, and city squares welcomed her with ceremonies reflecting local traditions. She visited bustling capitals, remote villages, tropical islands, mountain communities, and rapidly growing modern cities. Every destination introduced different cultures, languages, and histories. Yet her approach remained remarkably consistent. She listened carefully, observed respectfully, and avoided allowing personal opinions to overshadow the purpose of the visit. Constant travel inevitably required personal sacrifice. Birthdays were sometimes celebrated far from family. Anniversaries passed during official engagements. Christmas preparations occasionally competed with demanding schedules. While millions imagined royal life as endless luxury, reality often resembled continuous movement from one responsibility to another. Suitcases became familiar companions. Official cars replaced quiet evenings at home. Hotel rooms and government residences temporarily substituted for the places she loved most. Beneath every carefully planned journey lay the simple human reality of a woman spending much of her life away from those closest to her. Throughout these demanding years, Philip remained an indispensable source of support. Adjusting to his new role had not been easy. Before Elizabeth became queen, he had enjoyed a promising naval career built upon his own abilities and ambitions. Suddenly, those ambitions required profound change. Instead of commanding ships, he found himself walking several respectful steps behind his wife during official ceremonies. Instead of building an independent public identity, he became the husband of the sovereign, a position without clear historical definition in modern constitutional life. Such a transformation might have created resentment in another person. There were certainly moments of frustration, particularly during the early years. Philip possessed strong opinions, abundant energy, and an independent spirit. Adapting those qualities to a supporting role demanded patience from both husband and wife. Over time, however, they developed an understanding that balanced institutional responsibility with personal loyalty. Behind closed doors, he remained one of the few people able to speak to the Queen with complete honesty, challenging her ideas, making her laugh, and reminding her that beyond every ceremony remained an ordinary woman who still needed companionship. Their home life, whenever official duties allowed, was intentionally uncomplicated. Family dinners, conversations with the children, walks through gardens, evenings spent reading, and weekends in the countryside offered moments of normality carefully protected from public attention. The Queen treasured those ordinary experiences precisely because they contrasted so sharply with the formal nature of her public role. She had learned from childhood that happiness often existed, not in grand occasions but in familiar routines repeated quietly among people who loved one another. Among the simplest pleasures were horses. Long before becoming queen, riding had given her a sense of freedom difficult to find elsewhere. Throughout adulthood, she continued studying bloodlines, discussing breeding programs, attending races, and following the development of young horses with genuine enthusiasm. Animals never cared about constitutional convention. They responded only to patience, confidence, and kindness. Perhaps that honesty explained why she consistently found peace inside stables and across open fields. Far removed from official ceremonies and crowded receptions, dogs occupied an equally special place in her daily life. Generations of corgis followed her from one residence to another, greeting her with uncomplicated affection that ignored titles entirely. Palace staff sometimes joked that the dogs possessed greater confidence than visiting politicians because they moved freely wherever they pleased. The queen herself often smiled at such observations. After hours spent following strict protocol, she welcomed companions completely uninterested in etiquette. From a distance, newspapers captured glittering images of crowns, banquets, and magnificent processions. Those photographs were real, yet they represented only brief moments within a much larger existence. The true substance of her reign emerged through ordinary mornings, disciplined habits, careful listening, endless reading, and thousands of quiet decisions repeated day after day. Greatness, she gradually discovered, was rarely created by spectacular occasions alone. More often, it grew almost invisibly through consistency. And while the outside world admired the elegance of monarchy, new challenges were already approaching. The changing decades would soon test not only the institution she represented, but also her own family, proving that even a queen could not protect those she loved from the complicated realities of modern life. As the 1960s unfolded, the world surrounding the monarchy began changing at a pace that few earlier generations could have imagined. The country over which Elizabeth reigned was no longer the Britain her grandfather had known. Old industries were giving way to new technologies. Music, fashion, television, and youth culture transformed daily life. Traditional authority was questioned with growing confidence, and institutions once regarded as untouchable found themselves facing public criticism. The monarchy, despite its ancient roots, could not remain untouched by these changes. For centuries, distance had protected the royal family. Most people knew them only through official portraits, carefully written newspaper reports, and occasional public appearances. Mystery itself had strengthened the institution, but television was steadily removing that distance. Cameras entered homes every evening, bringing politicians, entertainers, athletes, and public figures into ordinary living rooms. People no longer wanted distant symbols alone. They wanted personalities. They wanted authenticity. They wanted to understand the human beings behind the formal titles. Elizabeth recognized that ignoring this transformation would slowly separate the monarchy from the people it was meant to serve. She rarely rushed toward change, yet neither did she refuse it entirely. Instead, she preferred careful adaptation. One thoughtful adjustment at a time seemed safer than dramatic reinvention. That philosophy would guide her throughout much of her reign. While others often sought immediate solutions, she believed institutions survived by changing gradually enough to preserve their foundations while remaining relevant to new generations. Perhaps no decision reflected that balance more clearly than allowing cameras to document the daily life of the royal family. When the idea was first proposed, many advisors worried it would diminish the dignity surrounding the crown. For generations, palace life had remained hidden from public view. Opening those doors, even partially, felt risky. Yet others argued that people could not continue supporting an institution they barely understood. Eventually, the decision was made to proceed, though with considerable caution. When the documentary was broadcast, millions of viewers watched scenes unlike anything they had previously imagined. They saw the Queen serving food at family barbecues, speaking naturally with her children, laughing during informal conversations, and performing ordinary tasks that rarely appeared in official photographs. There were no jeweled crowns, no military processions, and very few reminders of grand ceremony. Instead, audiences discovered a family attempting to balance extraordinary public responsibilities with remarkably familiar private routines. For many viewers, the effect was profound. The monarchy suddenly seemed less distant and more understandable. People who had previously regarded the royal family almost as historical figures realized they experienced many of the same small moments found in households across the country. Family meals, conversations around the table, children interrupting adults, shared laughter, and quiet evenings together all revealed a side of royal life that had rarely been visible before. The institution became more approachable, precisely because it appeared more human. Yet greater visibility brought unexpected consequences. Once cameras entered palace life, public curiosity grew stronger rather than weaker. Newspapers increasingly searched for personal stories instead of constitutional ones. Photographers competed to capture private moments. Ordinary disagreements that might once have remained inside family walls now risked becoming national headlines. The boundary separating public duty from personal life gradually became thinner with every passing year. The Queen understood that openness carried benefits, but she also discovered that every door opened slightly wider than intended. Through all these changes, one responsibility remained absolutely unchanged. Every week, regardless of political circumstances, the Prime Minister arrived for the private audience with the sovereign. Governments changed through elections. Ministers resigned. Parties celebrated victories before eventually suffering defeats. Economic crises appeared and disappeared. International tensions rose unexpectedly. Through every transition, the Queen listened patiently, maintaining the constitutional neutrality that had become one of the defining characteristics of her reign. She rarely expressed personal political opinions because she believed the monarchy could only unite the nation by remaining above political division. Leaders who met her often described remarkable preparation. She remembered conversations from years earlier, recalled details about previous meetings, and connected current events with historical experiences stretching back decades. Younger politicians occasionally entered, believing they possessed superior knowledge because they understood the latest developments. Many left surprised after discovering that the Queen's perspective extended across generations rather than election cycles. She had witnessed similar challenges before, though under different names and different governments. Experience gave her patience that could not be learned quickly. While public responsibilities expanded, family life continued evolving. Charles and Anne were joined by Andrew and later Edward, bringing new energy into the household. Despite demanding schedules, Elizabeth tried to preserve certain family traditions. Holidays at Balmoral remained especially important. There, official formality relaxed slightly. Family members walked across hills, enjoyed outdoor meals, rode horses, and spent evenings together away from London. The countryside offered a welcome contrast to palace routine. Surrounded by forests, rivers, and open skies, the Queen seemed noticeably more relaxed than during official engagements. Those who worked with her frequently observed how deeply she loved simple country life. She could spend hours discussing horses, studying breeding records, or walking with her dogs across familiar paths. Muddy boots often brought her greater happiness than polished state banquets. There was an honesty about nature that appealed to her. Seasons changed without consulting governments. Rivers continued flowing, regardless of political debates. Animals responded to patience rather than ceremony. These quiet pleasures grounded her, reminding her that beyond every constitutional responsibility remained the enduring rhythms of ordinary life. Philip also devoted increasing attention to causes that reflected his own interests. Rather than existing only as the Queen's companion, he developed initiatives supporting science, engineering, environmental conservation, and opportunities for young people. Among these efforts, one program would become particularly influential, encouraging generations of young men and women to develop practical skills, resilience, teamwork, and confidence through outdoor challenges. The project reflected his belief that character was built not only through education but through experience. Although public attention naturally focused upon the Queen, Philip quietly created a lasting legacy of his own. Their marriage continued balancing affection with the unique pressures of royal life. Long absences caused by overseas tours, often separated the family for weeks at a time. Official obligations rarely respected birthdays, anniversaries, or school events. Children sometimes saw parents less frequently than ordinary families might expect. Historians would later debate the personal cost of these arrangements, yet there was little realistic alternative. The monarchy required constant visibility, and that visibility demanded continuous travel. Duty repeatedly interrupted domestic routine, asking sacrifices that few outside the institution fully understood. As Britain entered the later years of the 1960s and the beginning of the 1970s, society became increasingly outspoken. Younger generations questioned inherited traditions, challenged authority, and demanded greater openness from public institutions. Newspapers adopted more aggressive styles of reporting. Television interviews became sharper and more personal. Respect no longer depended automatically upon position or title. It increasingly depended upon transparency and public trust. For the monarchy, this represented an entirely new environment, one in which symbolism alone would no longer guarantee enduring support. Elizabeth responded in the only way she truly knew. She continued working. While commentators debated the future of the monarchy, she visited factories, hospitals, schools, military bases, farms, and charities across the United Kingdom and throughout the Commonwealth. Every handshake, every conversation, every ribbon cut, and every speech reflected the same quiet philosophy she had embraced since youth. Institutions were not preserved by arguing about their value. They were preserved by showing up consistently, year after year, through times of celebration, as well as uncertainty. For a while, that steady approach seemed enough. Public approval remained strong, international respect continued growing, and the Queen's image became closely associated with stability in an increasingly unpredictable world. Yet beneath the calm surface of official life, new challenges were slowly taking shape inside her own family. The children who had once played freely across the grounds of Balmoral were becoming adults with dreams, relationships, and expectations of their own. The next chapter of the royal story would no longer be defined only by constitutional duty. It would increasingly be shaped by personal choices, public scrutiny, and the complicated realities of love, marriage, and modern celebrity. Challenges that would eventually test both the family and the institution more severely than anyone could yet imagine. The passing years brought new responsibilities not only for the Queen, but also for the next generation of the royal family. The children who had once played in the gardens of Balmoral and wandered through the long corridors of Windsor were no longer small. They were becoming adults, discovering their own identities beneath the enormous shadow of the crown. For Elizabeth, this transition carried a quiet hope. She believed that while the institution demanded sacrifice, it should never prevent her children from finding happiness. Yet history has often shown that happiness becomes far more complicated when lived beneath constant public attention. Charles, as the eldest son and heir to the throne, carried expectations, unlike those placed upon anyone else in the family. From childhood, he had been aware that one day he would become king, just as his mother had once realized that her own future had unexpectedly changed after the abdication crisis. Sensitive, thoughtful, and deeply interested in literature, architecture, history, and the natural world, Charles often appeared different from the image of confident leadership many people expected. He preferred conversation to ceremony and reflection to spectacle. Those qualities would later become strengths, but during his youth, they were sometimes misunderstood. The Queen cared deeply for her son. Though their relationship was shaped by the traditions surrounding monarchy, affection within the royal family rarely resembled the spontaneous warmth seen in ordinary households. Duty frequently separated parents from children. Official tours kept the Queen abroad for weeks at a time. Meetings with ministers, state visits, and public engagements filled nearly every day. Love certainly existed, but it was often expressed through consistency responsibility, and quiet concern rather than frequent displays of emotion. Historians have debated whether this distance created misunderstandings between mother and son, yet both remained bound by mutual respect throughout their lives. As Charles grew older, public interest in his personal future intensified. Newspapers speculated endlessly about whom he might marry. Every friendship attracted headlines. Every appearance beside a young woman inspired rumors. People understood that the future queen would eventually stand beside the future king, and curiosity expanded far beyond reasonable limits. Photographers followed him wherever he traveled. Journalists examined every conversation and every smile, searching for stories that would sell millions of newspapers. Privacy, already limited for the royal family, became increasingly difficult to preserve. The changing nature of the media transformed these personal matters into national conversations. Earlier generations of journalists had generally respected invisible boundaries around private family life. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, those boundaries were disappearing. Competition between newspapers grew increasingly fierce. Photographs captured through long camera lenses appeared almost daily. Anonymous sources claimed intimate knowledge of royal relationships. Ordinary disagreements that would have remained private in other families now became front-page headlines discussed across the country. Amid this growing attention, Lady Diana Spencer entered the public imagination. Young, graceful, and naturally warm with children and ordinary people, she seemed to embody a modern fairy tale. When her engagement to Prince Charles was announced, enormous excitement swept across Britain and much of the world. Crowds gathered wherever she appeared. Photographers documented nearly every step she took. Millions believed they were witnessing the beginning of another great royal romance, one that would unite youthful optimism with centuries of tradition. The wedding at St. Paul's Cathedral became one of the most watched events in modern history. Streets overflowed with spectators. Television audiences reached extraordinary numbers across continents. Bells rang through London while horses, soldiers, musicians, and ceremonial carriages recreated the timeless pageantry that had become closely associated with the British monarchy. For many people, it seemed as though history itself had paused to celebrate hope. The smiling faces, magnificent dress, and joyful atmosphere created memories that would remain vivid for decades. Yet life after the wedding proved far more difficult than the ceremony itself. Adjusting to royal life demanded extraordinary resilience. Every public appearance attracted relentless attention. Every decision invited criticism from one direction or another. Diana possessed remarkable compassion and connected naturally with people during hospital visits, charity events, and humanitarian work. However, the intense pressure surrounding the marriage gradually became impossible to ignore. Differences in personality, expectations, and communication slowly widened into painful distance. What had begun as a story celebrated around the world increasingly became a source of private unhappiness. For the Queen, these developments created profound sadness. She believed strongly in commitment, stability, and the importance of preserving family unity whenever possible. Watching difficulties unfold between her eldest son and his wife was painful, not only because they involved people she loved, but because every disagreement became public property. Private conversations seemed to find their way into newspapers. Personal letters were discussed on television. Speculation often replaced verified fact. Maintaining dignity under such conditions demanded enormous restraint from everyone involved. While challenges within the family attracted headlines, the Queen continued carrying out thousands of official duties with almost unchanged discipline. Hospitals still required visits. Ambassadors still presented credentials. Charities still depended upon royal support. Military ceremonies, state banquets, and diplomatic meetings filled her calendar exactly as before. Observers sometimes wondered how she maintained such consistency while private worries occupied her thoughts. Perhaps the answer lay in the philosophy she had inherited from her father. Personal hardship, however real, could never become an excuse for neglecting public responsibility. The 1990s brought even greater difficulties. Several marriages within the royal family ended in separation or divorce, creating an atmosphere of disappointment that contrasted sharply with the optimism surrounding earlier celebrations. Newspapers began referring to scandals almost daily. Commentators questioned whether the monarchy remained connected to modern society. Public confidence, once remarkably steady, appeared increasingly uncertain. The Queen herself acknowledged the extraordinary difficulty of that period, describing one year as particularly painful, a rare public admission that reflected the emotional weight carried behind palace walls. Then came the event that shook the monarchy more deeply than almost anything experienced during her reign. In the final days of the summer of 1997, news arrived that Diana, Princess of Wales, had died following a car accident in Paris. Shock spread across the world with astonishing speed. Flowers appeared outside royal residences in numbers never before witnessed. Millions of people mourned, not only a princess, but a woman whose compassion had touched countless lives through work with hospitals, humanitarian organizations, and vulnerable communities. The Queen was at Balmoral with her family when the tragedy occurred. Her first concern centered upon her grandsons, William and Harry, who had suddenly lost their mother while still very young. Believing they needed protection from overwhelming public attention, she chose to keep them in the relative privacy of the Scottish estate during the first days of mourning. From her perspective, she was acting as a grandmother before acting as a monarch. Many members of the public, however, interpreted her absence from London differently. Silence, once considered a sign of dignity, was now perceived by some as emotional distance. Criticism intensified rapidly. Newspapers questioned the response of the royal family. Television discussions reflected growing frustration. Never before had the Queen faced such widespread public misunderstanding. Eventually, she recognized that the country needed not only formal mourning but also visible reassurance. Returning to London, meeting members of the public, and delivering a rare televised address, she spoke not simply as sovereign but as grandmother and human being. The speech helped calm a nation struggling with grief while demonstrating that even long-established institutions sometimes needed to adapt to changing public expectations. Those difficult days taught one of the greatest lessons of her reign. Tradition remained important, but compassion had to be seen as well as quietly felt. The balance between privacy and public responsibility had changed forever. The monarchy survived the crisis, yet it emerged with a deeper understanding that future generations would inherit. Through sorrow, misunderstanding, and intense criticism, the Queen once again chose patience over confrontation, believing that trust could be rebuilt through steady action rather than emotional argument. Even so, the emotional cost of those years remained with her, and as a new century approached, she found herself entering the final stage of a reign that had already lasted longer than anyone had once imagined. As the new century unfolded, something remarkable began to happen. The young Queen, who had once stood nervously beneath the ancient arches of Westminster Abbey, had gradually become something very different in the eyes of the public. Generations who had never known another sovereign now regarded her almost as part of the landscape itself, as familiar as the changing seasons or the sound of church bells on a quiet Sunday morning. Governments continued to change. Technology reshaped daily life, almost beyond recognition. Fashions came and went, yet she remained, carrying out the same responsibilities with the same measured rhythm that had defined her reign from the very beginning. There was an unexpected comfort in that consistency. People did not necessarily agree with every tradition surrounding the monarchy, but many found reassurance in knowing that at least one institution still moved according to principles older than modern politics. During moments of uncertainty, whether economic downturns, international conflicts, or national tragedies, the Queen rarely attempted to dominate public conversation. Instead, she appeared quietly where she was needed, spoke carefully when words truly mattered, and allowed calmness itself to become a form of leadership. Perhaps nowhere was this more visible than during her annual Christmas broadcasts. Year after year, families gathered before television screens to hear the familiar voice that had accompanied their lives for decades. The speeches were never dramatic. They rarely contained political opinions or sensational declarations. Instead, they reflected upon kindness, perseverance, community, faith, and the importance of supporting one another through difficult times. Many viewers came to appreciate not simply what she said, but how she said it. Her voice carried neither urgency nor performance. It carried experience. Every sentence sounded as though it had been considered carefully before being spoken. The world around her, however, refused to remain still. The internet transformed communication. Social media altered the relationship between public figures and ordinary citizens. Information traveled across continents within seconds. Photographs that once required days to appear in newspapers now circled the globe almost instantly. Criticism became louder, praise became shorter, and public attention shifted more quickly than ever before. Institutions built upon patience suddenly found themselves living inside an age of constant reaction. The royal household understood that adaptation could no longer remain optional. Official websites appeared. Digital communication expanded. Younger members of the family embraced new ways of connecting with the public. The Queen herself never became fascinated by technology in the way younger generations often did. Yet she recognized its importance. She approached these developments much as she had approached television decades earlier. Technology was neither an enemy nor a miracle. It was simply another tool that needed to be used wisely without allowing it to replace genuine human connection. Throughout these changing years, one constant remained beside her. Philip continued performing thousands of engagements with remarkable energy, supporting charitable organizations, scientific research, education, environmental conservation, and countless community initiatives. Although his public manner could sometimes appear direct or unconventional, those who worked closely with him often described a man of extraordinary curiosity and determination. He possessed an active mind that never seemed satisfied with superficial answers. Wherever he traveled, he asked questions, examined new ideas, and encouraged innovation. Their marriage had now lasted longer than most people could easily imagine. Together they had experienced triumph, disappointment, celebration, criticism, private sorrow, and public expectation. They had raised 4 children, welcomed grandchildren, and later great-grandchildren. They had traveled together across continents and spent long periods apart because of official duties. Like every enduring marriage, theirs contained moments of disagreement and frustration. Yet beneath those ordinary human experiences rested an unwavering loyalty that quietly strengthened with time. They understood one another in abilities despite increasing age. Many people wondered where such endurance came from. Perhaps it originated in habit. After repeating the same discipline every day for more than half a century, work itself had become inseparable from daily life. Then came the global pandemic, a challenge unlike anything experienced during her reign since the Second World War. Streets emptied, businesses closed, families became separated by illness and restrictions. Fear returned to daily conversation in ways many people had never previously experienced. Once again, the nation looked toward familiar institutions, searching for reassurance. Although advanced in age and physically isolated for safety, the Queen addressed the country with quiet confidence. She reminded people that difficult times eventually passed, and that future generations would remember not only the hardship but also the courage shown by ordinary individuals caring for one another. Those words resonated deeply because they echoed experiences she herself had lived through. She remembered wartime blackouts, rationing, separation, uncertainty, and national recovery. She spoke, not as someone offering abstract encouragement, but as a woman who had witnessed history repeatedly demonstrate humanity's ability to endure. Millions listening to that address heard something rare in modern public life. They heard steadiness rather than panic. They heard patience instead of urgency. They heard a voice shaped by nearly an entire century of experience. Not long afterward came one of the greatest personal losses of her life. In the spring of 2021, Philip died after more than 70 years of marriage. Because restrictions remained in place during the pandemic, the funeral unfolded with unusual simplicity. Photographs from that day showed the Queen sitting alone inside St. George's Chapel, dressed in black, separated from other mourners by public health regulations observed throughout the country. The image quickly became one of the defining photographs of the era. People across the world recognized something deeply human within that quiet moment. There was no crown upon her head. No magnificent procession surrounded her. She appeared simply as an elderly widow, mourning the man who had shared nearly every chapter of her adult life. Titles disappeared beneath grief. Protocol faded before personal loss. Countless individuals who had themselves experienced bereavement during the pandemic saw reflections of their own loneliness in that single photograph. Perhaps more than any speech she ever delivered, that image reminded the world that even queens cannot escape the universal experience of saying goodbye to someone they love. Those closest to her noticed the absence immediately. Philip had often provided private encouragement after difficult days, offered honest opinions unavailable from anyone else, and filled quiet moments with conversation and humor. Now the castles, country houses, and palace rooms they had shared together carried memories that could never be repeated. Yet even after such profound loss, the Queen continued carrying out many of her remaining duties. Age had slowed her movements, but it had not diminished her sense of responsibility. She still met prime ministers, received visiting dignitaries when health permitted, reviewed official papers, and fulfilled the promise she had made as a young woman decades earlier. By the final year of her life, walking had become more difficult, and public appearances were necessarily reduced. Nevertheless, she remained determined to continue serving whenever possible. Each engagement carried additional significance because no one could be entirely certain how many opportunities remained. Staff members observed increasing physical frailty, yet they also observed the familiar determination that had accompanied her throughout every stage of her reign. The body may have grown weaker, but the discipline shaping her character had not changed. Quietly, almost imperceptibly, the final chapter of an extraordinary life was approaching, leading her once again toward the peaceful landscapes of Balmoral, where the story that had begun with a quiet ending would soon complete its circle. The final months of her life unfolded with the same quiet dignity that had shaped every stage of her reign. Age had gradually reduced the number of public appearances she could undertake, yet she continued following government affairs with careful attention. The familiar red boxes still arrived, carrying official papers that she insisted on reading whenever her health allowed. Ministers continued sending reports. Constitutional duties remained part of each day. Even as her physical strength diminished, her commitment to responsibility never seemed to weaken. After more than 70 years upon the throne, service had become as natural to her as breathing. During those last months, Balmoral once again became her refuge. Throughout her life she had returned to the Scottish estate whenever official schedules permitted. There, surrounded by hills, forests, rivers, and changing skies, she found a kind of peace that the great palaces of London could never fully provide. At Balmoral she could dress more simply, spend time outdoors, watch deer crossing distant fields, and listen to the quiet rhythm of nature rather than the constant movement of state affairs. The estate had witnessed her childhood laughter, family holidays, private conversations with Philip, and countless moments away from public attention. Perhaps it was fitting that history would also bring her back there at the end. Despite increasing frailty, she remained determined to fulfill important constitutional responsibilities. Only a short time before her death, she welcomed the newly appointed Prime Minister, Liz Truss, to Balmoral rather than cancelling the audience. Photographs from that meeting revealed an elderly queen leaning upon a walking stick, smiling with familiar warmth. Despite visible signs of declining health, Many people who later look back at those images recognized extraordinary determination within them. Even in her final days, she had chosen duty over comfort, honoring the promise first spoken as a young woman many decades earlier. Then came the 8th day of September, 2022. Concern began spreading quietly after doctors recommended that members of the royal family travel to Balmoral because of the Queen's condition. Throughout the afternoon, television broadcasts interrupted normal programming. Reporters gathered outside palace gates. Crowds assembled in respectful silence, sensing that an important chapter of history was approaching its conclusion. Rain drifted across London while people stood waiting, looking toward palace balconies that remained empty. The atmosphere carried the strange stillness that sometimes appears before life changes forever. Inside Balmoral, family members gathered as quickly as possible. Some arrived in time to be near her. Others were still traveling when the final moment came. There was no public ceremony, no grand farewell spoken before the world. The woman whose face had appeared upon coins, stamps, banknotes, and official portraits for generations left this world quietly, surrounded not by institutions but by family. After 70 years of constant public attention, the final chapter belonged once again to private love rather than public history. When the official announcement was released, a remarkable silence spread across the United Kingdom. Church bells began ringing across towns and villages. Flags slowly descended to half-mast. Crowds outside Buckingham Palace stood together without speaking. Strangers looked at one another with expressions that combined sadness, gratitude, and disbelief. For many people, the news carried an unusual feeling. They had never lived in a world without Queen Elizabeth II. Her reign had stretched across almost every memory they possessed. Suddenly, something that had always seemed permanent had quietly come to an end. Messages of condolence arrived from every continent. Presidents, prime ministers, kings, queens, religious leaders, and ordinary citizens expressed admiration for a life devoted to public service. Newspapers throughout the world devoted entire editions to remembering her achievements. Television channels replayed historic moments reaching back to her coronation. Photographs from different decades revealed not only changing fashions and technologies but also the remarkable continuity of one woman who had remained at the center of public life while the world transformed around her. The days that followed demonstrated the extraordinary place she had occupied in modern history. Long lines of mourners formed through London as people waited patiently for hours, sometimes throughout the night, simply to pass beside her coffin lying in state at Westminster Hall. Elderly men and women who remembered the Second World War stood beside young children who had known her only through television. People from different backgrounds, cultures, religions, and political beliefs shared the same quiet purpose. No one hurried. No one complained. Each person wished to offer a final gesture of respect before saying goodbye. The funeral itself combined magnificent tradition with deeply personal emotion. Military units marched through streets lined with silent crowds. Church choirs filled Westminster Abbey with music that echoed beneath ancient stone. Representatives from nations across the world gathered together beneath one roof, reflecting relationships built over decades of patient diplomacy. Yet amid all the ceremonial splendor remained one simple truth. A daughter, mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, wife, and friend was being remembered by those who had loved her long before history attached extraordinary titles to her name. After the public ceremonies concluded, she returned to the place where so many of the most meaningful moments of her life had unfolded. Beside Philip, the man who had walked faithfully beside her through more than 70 years of marriage, she was laid to rest within St. George's Chapel at Windsor. The separation that had lasted since his death finally ended. Together once more, they became part of the long history of the family they had served with unwavering dedication throughout their lives. It is tempting to measure such a life through records and statistics. She reigned longer than any previous British monarch. She worked with 15 prime ministers. She witnessed astonishing technological revolutions and enormous political change. She met millions of people and traveled across the globe more extensively than almost any sovereign before her. All of those facts are remarkable, yet they explain only part of her story. Numbers describe duration, but they cannot fully describe character. Perhaps her greatest achievement was not preserving tradition exactly as it had always existed, nor transforming it beyond recognition. Instead, she quietly guided an ancient institution through one of the most rapidly changing periods in human history. She accepted that the world would continue evolving, yet believed that certain values remained worth protecting: patience, discipline, dignity, service, reliability. These were not dramatic qualities, and they rarely attracted headlines. Nevertheless, they became the foundation upon which her extraordinary reign rested. There is a quiet lesson hidden within her story. Though she herself rarely spoke in the language of lessons, she never claimed to possess all the answers. She seldom attempted to explain how others should live. Instead, she demonstrated something through daily example. Purpose is often found not in extraordinary moments, but in ordinary responsibilities repeated faithfully over many years. Greatness sometimes grows so slowly that those living beside it hardly notice until they look back across an entire lifetime. The story that began beside the peaceful hills of Scotland has now returned to them once more. The river still flows through the valley. Purple heather continues moving beneath the autumn wind. Clouds drift above the mountains exactly as they did long before a little girl named Elizabeth first visited Balmoral. Nature has always understood what people sometimes forget. Every life, no matter how extraordinary, eventually becomes part of a larger story that continues after we are gone. Perhaps that is why her journey continues to resonate with so many people. She did not choose the path that history placed before her. She did not seek the burden that unexpectedly became hers as a young woman of 25. Yet once that responsibility arrived, she carried it with remarkable consistency until the very end. The applause faded. The ceremonies ended. The crown passed to another generation. But the promise she made as a young princess, to devote her whole life to service, remained unbroken. And in that quiet faithfulness, more than in any jeweled crown or royal procession, the true measure of Queen Elizabeth II may forever be found.